having me. I don't consider it a misfortune to have gone to Virginia Tech. Although, if there are any Clemson fans here, you probably have some things to say to us after that debacle in Blacksburg last weekend. I wasn't there. We were on a ministry retreat, so I'm actually probably glad I didn't make the 6-hour drive back to Blacksburg to watch us get stomped. I'm actually, if we're talking about blessings, I actually have 5 kids because so I have a 10-year-old daughter, and that's part of my testimony I'll tell you about in a minute. I have a 9-year-old son. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and in March 15th, we started fostering a young boy who turned 4 in June. His name is Jason. Jason is now we've started the process of adoption, and it should go through anywhere in the next month to November, so he will officially become a marshal. And so I actually have 5 kids now, and then my youngest, Isabel, is 3 years old. So we are busy at the Marshall household, and a lot going on, but we are more than blessed, and it's part of my testimony, because the reality is that I shouldn't be here right now doing this. I shouldn't be anywhere. I mean, in many cases, I probably shouldn't even be alive because of the choices that I made for the majority of my life. And so I wanted to give just a brief testimony. I think Bob heard me give my testimony at the FCA lunch a couple months ago. And really, we talk about the power of Jesus, and there really is no other explanation for the difference in my life now. Not at all because it's perfect, because of my life is a mess, but because of Jesus, I live, and because of Jesus, my family has, I have everything that I have now. And so, my story, I grew up in Blacksburg, Virginia, actually, so I grew up a Hokie, so I can't help it. My dad actually went to Virginia Tech, and my dad is not a believer, still not to this day. And so we did not grow up going to church at all. Church was not even something that even entered our paradigm, and that's just never even entered my mind that's what you did. Maybe I went to some things, some church functions, maybe growing up, like youth group and stuff, but it was mostly just to hang out with my friends. Probably had some questions about things, but never really explored anything. And went off to college. Actually went to College of Charleston because they had a really good girl-to-guy ratio. That was the reason I wanted to go there. And I was, when you think of someone who's just lost in the world, that was me. I was an alcoholic. My granddad was an alcoholic. Alcoholism runs to my family, I'll say that. I was an alcoholic. Drugs, sex, you name it. Dated a young lady when I was in college. She got pregnant. We had an abortion. I mean, I was in the world and miserable, but in the world. And so along the way, I met this young lady, and we actually ended up getting married right out of college. And it was probably, looking back, not the smartest decision. But one of the things I was really doing was actually rebelling against my family. I had a lot of anger towards my dad and my mom, and so I was rejecting pretty much everything that I had learned growing up. They're very conservative. I became very, very, very liberal, both in my politics and in the way I live my life. I moved out to Texas, and I actually worked for the same organizing group that Barack Obama used to work for up in Chicago. I worked for that group, started by a guy named Saul Alinsky. I worked for that group in Texas. Saul Alinsky dedicated one of his books, Reveille for Radicals, to the first great radical, Satan. Dedicated his book to him. And I was working for that group. So married, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life really, so I decided to go to law school, just kind of thinking that would be something I could sort of figure things out more. Again, marriage is a disaster, life is a disaster, alcoholism, drugs, you name it. Going to law school was good in one sense, but in another sense, the law school there was maybe one conservative Christian professor there, and everyone knew to kind of stay away from him because they thought he was crazy. And I just sort of imbibed all of that. My constitutional law professor, her husband was the head of the Atheist Party of Texas. And so, none of this, I mean, again, just swimming in all of that, I had developed a worldview that went right along with it. We teach at Ratio a lot that worldviews are more caught than they're taught. Most of us, we just pick up our worldviews from culture all around us. Most of our Christian kids have picked up their worldview from the culture around them, and that was certainly true of me. And so here I was, again, life was pretty miserable, and my marriage was falling apart, but got a law degree from Texas and decided to move back to Charlotte to work for a criminal defense attorney. Now, the criminal defense attorney that I worked for was an anti-theist. So he wasn't just a non-Christian, he was a non-Christian who thought that Christians were the worst people in the world. And I started imbibing all of his beliefs. I never would have, in fact, actually, I would have characterized myself as a Christian the whole time, all of my 20s. I would have said I was a Christian because, I'd gone to church a couple times. And hey, that's just what you were. But I started picking up his beliefs, and I started reading atheist literature. I don't think I ever actually became a full-bore atheist, but it was the moral decisions that I was making in my life that was driving the ideology, and I think that is 100% true. Well, I think that's very true of what we see on campuses with students. It's the moral decisions that are driving our belief systems. And so life is miserable, making good money, but sort of have the American dream, and it's a disaster. And in 2006, my wife decided she was leaving me. And honestly, and this is, even just saying this, it just sounds terrible, but I wasn't particularly upset, right? I just said, okay, great, I can sort of trade horses, I can get somebody new. I think a very modern view of marriage. You just take somebody else out and you plug that person in. And so then I started dating around, and again, sex and drugs and alcohol are all involved in all this. And I remember, so my ex's mother-in-law was the one that would talk to me about Jesus, probably still, I think, one of the most godly women I know. And she called me, this was now August of 2006, and I remember she called me one time. The last interaction we had before she had left was she tried to show me a sermon. She tried to sit me down to listen to a sermon, and I remember I was so angry at her. I yelled at her because she had the audacity to want me to listen to a Christian sermon. And that was the last interaction we had. And then a couple months later, she called me and basically just asked me this. She said, "What are you doing with your life?" And I said, "I don't know." I was miserable. And so I tried. There were some attempts at reconciliation with my ex. She wasn't interested. And I think it was very prideful and selfish on my part. I wasn't really interested in reconciling. To be a leader of a family, I was wanting just to fix things on my own. So she filed for divorce. The divorce went through. I was miserable, but I wasn't miserable enough to change anything. And so I started, I had been seeing a young lady, and we went out. I finally got a new job, and so we went out to celebrate, and got drunk as I would every time I would go out. And 2 weeks later, she called me and she told me she was pregnant. So here I was, and she had just gotten divorced too. So she's divorced, I'm divorced, and she's pregnant. And I remember I went home, I went home to my now half-empty house I was living in. I literally spent that whole night just crying in this empty guest bedroom. I was suicidal. I didn't have a gun at the time, but I just wanted to end it all. It was, my life was miserable. And I do believe that was the beginning of God. It was almost like God saying, "Are you done yet? We can keep going." And I remember crying out to Him, saying, "I have nothing. This is the mess of a life when I'm in charge." And I cried out to Him. And so, backwards as it sounds, I said we should start dating to the mother of my child. And so we started dating, and I said, we need to go to church. Now again, if you think about it, two divorcees and now pregnant, and for most of us, that's the last place we'd ever go, because church can be the most judgmental, terrible place for people that are in sin. But if we understand the power of Jesus, that should be the place that we should we should be welcoming people like us. And we found this church. We were driving down in Ballantyne in South Charlotte, and there was a sign on the side of the road, and it said this church plant that had just started. And I said, we're going there. Now, I didn't know anything about anything, and I believe it was God's providence, because we could have ended up at a Mormon tabernacle. We could have ended up anywhere. And I said, we're going there. And that was the place where we were introduced to what grace was. Because we went into this place so nervous and scared, both of us divorced, she's pregnant, and they loved on us, but they loved on us in a way, like Bob was saying, that they said, this is sin, and it is terrible, but God's grace and love is bigger than this. And so so God was getting a hold of me, and He was doing a work in my heart, and we recognized that what we'd done was terrible, and there was long nights of just crying and calling out to God for forgiveness. And then there was this grace and mercy of understanding who I was now in Jesus. And it was incredible. And my wife, the same thing was happening for Jess, and then we ended up having my daughter, and then we got married, and then the next year we had my son, and I started my own law firm, and life was just moving along, and we were, things were going great seemingly because now we had Jesus. But the reality, though, is I was falling right back into the world. And we see in 1 John 2, right, do not love the world or the things that belong to the world, because the world will choke out your faith in that. I had just been through the ringer and come out on the back end, and I believe I was genuinely the Lord's. The Lord had saved me, but I was falling right back into the world and falling right back into this idea of this American dream, this false American dream. And our marriage was still, we brought tons and tons of baggage to our marriage. It was, there was just lots and lots of brokenness still there. And so I remember in 2009 is when things really changed. I genuinely believe I was the Lord's before, but two things happened. Number one, my grandmother got really sick and ended up dying, and she was in hospice, and she was in her bed. And I remember she was probably one of the most genuine Christians that I knew my whole life. And she said, I'm ready to go home. She was completely calm. She was at peace, and every one of us were freaking out. And so I said, what does, in my mind, I'm like, what does she have that we don't have, this real sense of peace? And I want that. I really wanted that. And then secondly, and so that was happening. And then secondly, the church that we had gone to, the one we were just picked out providentially by that road sign, that pastor of that church had gone to a seminary in Charlotte, Southern Evangelical Seminary, and they taught this thing called apologetics. Now, I had no idea what that was, right? I didn't really, I didn't want to apologize for my faith, all these kind of things you hear all the time. But I was interested in, they had this home study course that they were putting out, and I kept up with them on their website. And I looked at this, and this home study course said things like, you can know that there is objective truth in the world, that there are objective moral truths in the world, that Christianity has to be the only way, not that it's intolerant to believe that Jesus is the only way, but it has to be the case, that heaven really does exist, and you can know these things. And that was really interesting to me, because I'd never heard any of this stuff before. In fact, I had always been told you couldn't ask questions, you couldn't investigate these things, and evidences, what are you talking about? It's all about faith. And I thought that was, knowing what I know now, I think it's a false view of what faith is, but I was very, very interested. And so I paid the money, I bought the course. This was now summer of 2009, and literally we kind of joke about this with my wife. It was like I was born again. I was being transformed by the renewing of my mind, Romans 12. I was all of the questions I'd always had, I was now getting really good answers to. And it was changing the way I thought about everything. And when I changed the way I thought about things, it then changed the way I ended up acting in certain ways. And it wasn't, it wasn't this overnight process where I just became like Jesus, because I'm still a mess and a work in progress. But my ideas were changing. The way I lived my life was changing, because I was getting good answers to the questions I had always asked. And I believe that's why apologetics is so important. And so the rest of the story is I started going to seminary there. I could take classes on this stuff. I had never even heard these things before, but I was getting all kinds of I mean, God was just doing an amazing work in my life. Marriage was changing, life was I mean, it was incredible. And I thought, man, I would love to be able to work with college students, because I know for me, that's where my whole life took a turn for the worse, where I was there and I was imbibed in this culture and I didn't get good answers to the questions I had. Now, I was so prideful and arrogant, I probably wouldn't have even listened if someone would have given me answers. But if only there was a place where we could ask good questions, we could seek good answers. And it was then that we discovered Ratio Christi. Ratio Christi was just being born out of Southern Evangelical Seminary at the time, and in 2011 had become its own separate 501c3. And actually, the guy who was in charge at the time said, is anybody interested in going to Virginia Tech to start a Ratio chapter? And I said, this is great. This sounds awesome. And turns out for a variety of reasons, we didn't end up there. But in August of 2012, we moved here to start the Ratio Christi chapter here at UNCW. And in the last 5 years, God has really done amazing things through the ministry. Tom Jaskey is now on staff with us. Grant Forrester and Lexi Forrester are coming on staff with us. John Zeno is about to be coming on staff with us eventually when we can get him. But we have grown the chapter from nothing to now we're on the campus of UNCW. We're at Cape Fear. I teach apologetics classes at Coastal Christian High School. As part of our ministry, I've been doing that for 4 years. We are on the high school campuses at Laney, or at Ashley, at Hoggard, at New Hanover, hopefully at Laney. And God has just been doing an incredible work in my life, and I think in this community through this ministry. And so that's my testimony, but the other thing Bob wanted me to ask or talk about is, what is God showing me? And I think one of the things that He's showing me over and over and over and over again is the need for an apologetics ministry in the high schools and on college campuses. Now, for some of you may not, what does apologetics mean? Apologetics just comes from the Greek word apologia, which just means to give a defense. So apologetics is just giving a defense for why we believe what we believe as Christians. We think the evidence is on our side. We think Christianity is true, and therefore it's true for all people at all times, at all places, and we want to show students that there's good reasons to believe Christianity, because apart from Christianity, you can't make sense of reality because it is reality. You can't make sense of what happened in Las Vegas, I would contend, on Sunday, apart from a Christian worldview, because you can't call it evil. Because what is evil if God doesn't exist? And where does evil come from? It comes from within, not without. And then how do I deal with the sin that's within me? It's only Jesus. Because of what He did on the cross and then 3 days later in His resurrection. Those are true things that happened. They really happened in space and time. And we can give good evidence to show that that's true. And so J. Gratian Meechan has this great quote. I want to read it because it's a little long, but I think this is why we need, one of the reasons why apologetics is so important, especially on the college campus. He says, God usually exerts power for conversion in connection with certain prior conditions of the human mind, and it should be ours to create, so far as we can, with the help of God, those favorable conditions for the reception of the gospel. He says, false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation or of the world to be controlled by ideas which, by the resistless force of logic, prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. And that's exactly how many of the professors on the campus at UNCW look at Christianity, as a delusion. So what can apologetics do? I think it can do a couple things, and then I'm going to hand it over to Grant here in 1 second. I think apologetics can answer honest intellectual questions that Christians have. All of our students have lots and lots of questions. Just as an example, last year, one of our students, she was coming to Ratio. She is a professing believer, and she started asking lots of questions, and she realized her whole life she'd been a professing believer. She did not know the Lord. She didn't know the gospel. She asked good questions, she sought good answers, and now I genuinely believe that she's the Lord's. And it was from wrestling with these questions. So we can answer honest questions. We can also expose what we call pseudo-intellectual objections. There's someone who's very close to me who, if I asked him why he wasn't a Christian, he would say, what about the Australian Aborigine who's never heard of Jesus? You're telling me if he dies that he goes to hell, but Hitler on his deathbed, if he converts to Christianity, he would be in heaven. Now, I think we've got good answers to that question, so if you want to talk about that, we can. But the thing is, he raises that question all the time, and I've asked him before, this is a great question to ask people, if I could answer that question, if I could answer all of your questions about Christianity to whatever standard you require, if I could do that, would you become a Christian? He said no. Which tells me what? He doesn't have intellectual objections. He has emotional and spiritual objections, which is fine. I think most of our doubt is probably emotional and spiritual. But let's deal with that as it is and not pretend that it's this intellectual objection. And then finally, so we can answer good questions, we can sort of expose pseudo-intellectual objections, and then we can also build up the faith of the believers. And we've seen that time and time and time again on campus. So let me just give you a couple examples. A couple years ago, a student emailed me. He said, "We've got to talk. I grew up in a Christian household, but now I'm taking a class. If you send your students to the state university, they take a New Testament class, almost assuredly the professor is not going to be a believer. And most likely is going to be an ex-believer with probably an axe to grind." I think that's maybe my terminology, but I think it's probably true. And he was challenged in his New Testament class, and he didn't have good answers. And he was rocked in his faith. And we met, and we met over the course of a semester and then the year, and we gave him good answers, and now this guy is probably one of the most solid believers that I ever met. And it's not anything because of the things that I could tell him, it's just because the answers we have are there. Another student that I'm meeting with now took the same professor's class, and it rocked his faith, and now he's getting good answers to these objections, and I don't know where he would have been if he wasn't a place where he could go good answers. And he told me, he said that a lot of the other ministries, this is nothing against the other ministries, Ratio is a very small slice of what we're doing on the campus. So we're not better, or we just do something different than the other ministries. But he said that when he had these questions, and he would take them to these other pastors and ministers, they just told him to stop asking those kind of questions, or just some of them would just tell him just to have faith, which I think is like committing spiritual malpractice. Because we should ask these questions. We should have the courage to ask these questions. So I wanted to bring up at the very last bit, so this is Grant Forrester. Grant was a student who we met when he was young in his faith, maybe you'd say, at UNCW, and just wanted to talk briefly about, again, why apologetics is so important and what it's done in his life on the campus of UNCW.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really honored to have this opportunity. As Aaron said, my name is Grant Forrester, and as of this past May, my wife and I graduated from UNCW, and we're now moving towards being on staff with Ratio Christi. Why? Because apologetics in Ratio Christi has changed my life. I came to UNCW after leaving a church in my hometown, and I was a part of the youth ministry, and I was leadership in the youth ministry, and I taught, and I discipled, and I mentored, and I thought I had all the answers, because I was the guy that everybody came to with their questions, and I had answers. When I came to UNCW, and I took my very first, I was a freshman, Philosophy 101. The professor found out I was a Christian, and a week later, he took the opportunity to challenge me in front of 85 students. He was giving a lecture on morals, what's right and wrong, and ethics, how to apply what's right and wrong, and what we know to be true about God. And he said, we know that these things about morals and ethics are true, and we think that this is what we know to be true about God. And since we know these are true, then God can't exist. So he finishes his entire lecture on this, in his mind, disproving God, and probably in a lot of other students' minds, disproving God. And says, Grant, you told me last week you were a Christian. What do you make of all of this? So, in the very back of the class, 74 students turn around in their chairs and looking me in the eyes and thinking, oh, this guy must be Nostradamus. This guy's got all the answers. Well, if it hadn't been for Ratio Christi, the Monday before this exact lecture, I wouldn't have had any answers, because Aaron stood up the Monday before this exact class and taught on the same argument that my professor was giving that class period. And he said, this is what they're going to argue. This is the evidence that they purport to have. This is what we believe. This is why what we believe is true and based in reality. And this is how you argued your point. So I stood up and I gave the professor my 30-second spiel. And he listened real intently and he rubbed his eyebrows together for a second. He was processing the information. And he said, say that one more time. So I said it one more time. And he listened again, and he thought about it, and he was thinking through what I was saying. And then he moved on with his lecture. He didn't have anything to say. He didn't tell me I was delusional and to get out. He didn't just try to tell me that I was a Christian, I didn't know what I was talking about. He just moved on, next point. And for the rest of the semester, other Christian students would come up to me after class, and they would say, the professor said this today. What do you think about that? So I had the opportunity, thanks to apologetics and what I was learning at Ratio Christi, to take these students aside and to walk them through the evidence that we know to be true about reality, what we know to be true about Christianity, and how all of creation sings to God's existence. And even more so, there was a dear friend of my wife's. She was sitting next to me. She's an atheist, and she loves being in debates with Christians about why what we believe is ridiculous. And she now had the opportunity. She was moved to continue to have conversations like that with me as well. And we continue to have conversations like that to this day. Because of the evidence that the whole class, now the professor, realizes that there is for Christianity. And if it hadn't been for God putting me in that class and giving me the opportunity to have that stage, that platform, then none of that would have happened. If I hadn't had apologetics, none of that would have happened. But it's thanks to this ministry at UNCW and thanks to what I've learned as a student that I can continue to have these conversations and continue to talk to Christians like all of you, continue to talk to students who are moving into the university and get them ready for the challenge that is going to come. Because many students don't have the opportunity to stand in front of their class like I did. A lot of them take their questions home, they put their heads on their pillows at night, and then they wrestle through these questions for years because they may not even know that apologetics is a thing. They may not even know that there are answers. But it's thanks to this ministry that we can take these answers to these students and that we can help the students who have been challenged and help the students who are lying awake in their beds at night.
So yeah. And we're not saying in any way that we have all the answers or that we have to be the answer man. We're just saying that Christianity has the answers. So you should never be afraid to ask the questions. We should never be afraid to entertain the hardest questions that these students have. In fact, we should encourage them to ask questions because we know that if someone's pursuing truth, they'll find Jesus. So we thank you for having us. If you're interested in finding out things that we're doing on campus, we're doing a science and faith event at the Bridge Church October 29th from 6:30 to 9:30 that we'd love to have people come to. We're doing an event on campus. We're doing an apologetics conference in the spring. If you're interested in learning about any of these things, you can get on our sign-up list, our email list. We'd love to tell you more about what we're doing in the community.